Hello, everyone, and welcome to the podcast. Today is part three of this initial exploration that we've been doing on burnout. And as I've shared, according to the World Health Organization, burnout is when we have chronic or long term work stress that is just not managed successfully. And so, some of the common symptoms of this are exhaustion or tiredness, disconnection from our work, or just being cynical, negative about the work we're doing and feelings of reduced self efficacy, which is basically we just don't feel as effective as we used to be. It might be hard to concentrate, and we just don't feel as though our work is of the same quality. So, in the last two episodes, we explored the first two components of the burnout model that I'm calling the demand choice support model. And in episode one, we talked about 5 strategies for managing life's demands. In episode two, we talked about 5 choices you can make to lessen the stress you have around your work. And today we're talking about support strategies, which I'm expanding to really include coping strategies. So these aren't strategies that change the problem or the things that are causing the burnout or the stress, but these strategies help us carry the weight of it. And so I'm glad you joined, and I'm looking forward to jumping in.
Now available. You deserve to love your job. How to find your purpose and enjoy your life. You may not have learned this growing up, but you deserve to love your job. You will spend more time at work than in any other activity in your life, and you deserve to love it. Research tells us that people who love their work are twice as likely to enjoy their life. This book will help you create a blueprint to help you fulfill your purpose, love your job, and live the life you were designed to live. Now available at Amazon.
So again, our overall model for these last 3 episodes has been the demand choice support model. And for the support element, the model suggests that support from others, whether it's family, friends, coworkers, all of that support acts as a buffer from burnout, meaning that even if the demands of our life are the same, we have the same level of choice, really nothing in our work changes, the more support we have, the less likely we are to burn out. And burnout and stress, as I'm sure you all know, is just a huge problem in our society, in the US, really in the world. And there was a study done by the APA. Well, they were reporting on a study that was done, and they found that when we think about the stress of our lives, about half of it, 52%, was from work-related things. And the other 48% of the stress we feel is from personal related things. So whether that work is about a job we're doing or the work we're doing in our personal life, or just what we're experiencing in our personal life, we're dealing with a lot of stress in both, in both aspects of our world. And it's also a lot of research that talks about the way stress impacts our physical health. So, 43% of all adults suffer adverse health effects from stress. That's one study. And I think most of us would agree with that. But there was also a study that said 75% to 90% of all doctors' office visits are for stress-related ailments and complaints. And honestly, when I first heard that stat, I thought it was a little hard to believe, 75 to 90%, based on stress-related ailments. But I looked into it a little bit more, and I want to explain how that might work and how they got to that conclusion. So the study itself looked at patient records. So it was done in the early 80s, and they looked at the charts of patients from Kaiser Permanente. And from those charts, the physicians themselves reflected that 60 to 90% of the visits, there was some element of either emotional distress or somatization, which is basically a psychological distress that's expressing itself in a physical symptom. So headache, chest pains, blood pressure, etc. So, when I think about it that way, I see how we get to that stat. And let me just add a caveat. I'm not a medical doctor. So if you get sick with me, I always say the most I can give you is some water or church fan and call 911. And of course, I'm going to be praying for you. But my doctorate is a PhD, not an MD. And that doctorate is in IO psychology, which is about the study of human behavior at work, not the body. But I have a body. I've done a lot of research on the topic. And it's just an interest of mine in terms of our physical health and how it relates to stress. And I certainly have experiences to pull from myself or others. But this is not medical advice. This is just something to consider from my personal experience and the things I've learned from a psychological perspective. But okay, caveat over, our bodies in general are designed to experience stress, right? So sometimes we experience good stress, which is called eustress, which is maybe we got married, our responsibilities got bigger, we have a child, we get a promotion at work. So these things expand our responsibility, but it can also be experienced as really positive stress, can keep us alert, ready, help us grow, add value to our lives. But stress can also be negative stress, which is called distress. And that is when we face continuous challenges and we don't have a chance to relax or have really relief between those challenges. So that long-term negative stress just continues in our being in terms of what we feel, but also in our physical body. And what they say is that over time, that physical stress, it might be stress related tension. It can show up in the chemicals moving around our bodies, our hormones, et cetera. But over time, that just distress in our body can lead to physical symptoms that probably most of us have experienced. Things like headaches, upset stomachs, higher blood pressure. I think about, I often have what I call sometimes the white coat syndrome when you go to the doctor and maybe there's some procedure they're going to be doing, and just the thought of that procedure sends your blood pressure higher. That has happened to me more than once at the doctor. So, that's an example of this mental, emotional stress showing up as a physical symptom, right? So blood pressure is one. It could be chest pain, trouble sleeping. But, research also suggests that this stress can turn on or even worsen certain symptoms of disease. And I was just sharing this with a friend of mine recently. I know if I have a light headache and then I experience stress, and I can feel the tension in my muscles and I'm not cognizant of it and don't purposely choose to relax and like not let that stress build up on my body, then the headache will worsen, and it'll get worse and worse over time. And I love the way the Mayo Clinic laid out kind of how stress can show up in your life. And they share that stress can show up as an impact to our physical body, it can show up as an impact to our mood or on our behavior. And they have a list. So I'm going to give you an example of some of how these things can show up in these different ways. So stress can show up in our body, as I mentioned, as a headache. It can show up in our mood in terms of anxiety and worry. And it can show up in our behavior in maybe we overeat or undereat, right? So can we say comfort foods? That would be an example of stress showing up in a behavior. Another example, it can show up in our body as muscle tension or pain. It can show up in our mood as restlessness, right? Just I can't get to sleep, I can't rest, I don't have a lot of peace. Or it can show up in our behavior as frustration or angry outbursts, right? So stress can have a multi-layered effect on us physically, emotionally, and the choices and behaviors that we distribute. Let's do one more. So another impact on your body could be fatigue. An impact on your mood could be a lack of motivation, lack of focus. It could even be memory problems. And then how it can show up in our behavior is we could drink more, use drugs and alcohol, use tobacco, avoid friends, staying at home. So again, stress can really have a multi-layered effect and show up in a lot of different ways. And so that's how, in all those ways, stress can really impact our physical health as well. So today we're going to dig in a little bit on how that can happen, and more importantly, what you can do to buffer yourself from the impacts of that stress, which we know are significant. I thought it was interesting that OSHA, which is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, has declared stress a hazard of the workplace, and it is absolutely a business cost. I mean, can you think about one study showed that stress cost American industry, more than $300 billion annually. When you think about it, imagine how much less absenteeism or how much absenteeism there is because of stress. Imagine our healthcare costs and how they're impacted by the stress we feel, and even just reduced productivity. How creative, how productive are we when we are in working in a lot of stress or have a lot of stress in our body or in our minds? Um, it relates a little bit to what I was saying earlier around just it's hard to be effective, and that being one impact or one symptom of burnout is it's just hard to be effective at work. So I'm looking forward today to talking about the support aspect, especially because it's the element of this model, demand choice support model, that I've probably neglected the most. So just the preparation for this has helped me really evaluate my level of coping and support, how well I use some of these strategies and what I can do differently. And I hope you'll use this conversation in the same way. I've even tried a couple of new strategies just in preparation for this conversation, so we might get to those as well. So let's jump in. There are four categories of coping and support kind of strategies you can use. So I want to kind of lay out the four. We'll just touch on real briefly two of them and spend more time on two of the other ones. So the four categories are action strategies, negative strategies, emotional strategies, and support from others. So I'm not going to talk a lot about action strategies because that's pretty much what we focused on the last two episodes. So that's things we can actually do to impact the level of demands we have, how we're going about meeting those demands in our life. Some people label these action strategies as problem-focused coping strategies because they're the things we actually do to solve the problem. So these are concrete plans, action steps, changes we make to really solve the problem or improve our situation. And these strategies can be super helpful when the problem is solvable. But, when these strategies are not very helpful, or may even be getting in the way, is that the problem isn't solvable. If it's something that we really have to endure or live with rather than, quote unquote, solve, these action-oriented strategies are really kind of a waste of time. So we're going to take those off of the table because we talked about them previously. And I'm also not going to spend time on negative strategies, but it's important to be aware of those. So those are things that we do to cope that actually probably make things worse for the situation or for us. And most of them involve something to excess. So drinking too much, using drugs, nicotine, over exercising, overeating, not eating at all, denial, which my friend Emery calls being delulu, which is hilarious to me, but denial, becoming a hermit and not sharing with others, even toxic positivity, optimism taken to the extreme where, oh, I'm great. How are you? I'm great. And you're really not great. So these are kind of negative strategies, and we all do them from time to time. It's just being able to recognize them in our life and as quickly or as often as we can choose a different strategy instead. Either the action strategies we talked about the last couple of episodes or the two additional strategies we'll talk about today. So we won't focus on action or negative strategies, but you do want to be aware of them. And if you feel like the negative strategies are being overused in your life, that's absolutely a place to start. And one way you can do that is, sometimes there's a saying that you don't break habits, you replace them. So one way to do that is to figure out, okay, when am I going to that negative strategy? When am I going to not eating or over exercising or, just denial? And what can I do instead of that? And so we'll talk today about two additional strategies you can use instead of those negative strategies that we all use from time to time, but we don't want to use them on a consistent basis. So one of the categories we are going to jump into is the emotional strategy or emotional strategies. So these are not at all about changing the situation. These are about managing the negative emotions we have around a situation. And so these can be super helpful when we're dealing with situations that we can't necessarily change or even control, maybe not even influence. And some examples kind of those scenarios we might face might be one, other people. So you can think about going through a breakup. Maybe you wanted the relationship, the other person didn't. There's not a lot that can be done about that, but you still may have negative emotions around that you need to manage. Similarly, could be being laid off. You might be able to plan going forward some actions, but in terms of dealing with what is, there's probably not a lot we can do about the company's business situation or their decisions they've made about laying off. This also can show up, I think, about caring for an infant that maybe has colic or health issues, stomach issues, maybe just emotional as an infant. They cry a lot. You can't get any sleep, even though you're super sleepy. Lord knows I think about that. Like Kelvin and I, my husband, we tried all the strategies to try to get my daughter to sleep when she was little. I can't even count the number of sleep devices, things to put in the bed, drops, sound machines, temperature controls, I mean, noisemakers, etc., that we tried to get her to sleep for more than, 90 minutes, 2 hours at a time. And pretty much none of them worked. So we were investing all our time in these action strategies that didn't work. What we could have invested in were emotional strategies that helped us just deal with the emotions of that time. Um, these strategies are also helpful in certain scenarios that are often out of our control. For example, being at the airport. I don't know. I don't think I've ever been more frustrated than I've been at airports. I mean, I think a lot of it is that you just are completely at the mercy of the airline, TSA, the airport, weather, mechanical issues. And there's just not a lot you can do if you want to get on that plane. You can leave, but other than that, there's not a lot you can do. Traffic could be another one. If you live in an area where you deal with a lot of traffic, that's another one where there's just not a lot you can do about it. So these are things that help us be these strategies help us be more emotionally intelligent. And part of emotional intelligence is it's two things. So emotional intelligence is being able to recognize and influence the emotions of ourselves and others. So when we think about it for ourselves, the first step is being able to actually recognize the emotions that we're feeling, right? And that in and of itself is a strategy. Identifying, naming, recognizing the emotions that we're feeling. And I love that this strategy is now often taught in classrooms, which is, phenomenal because I think most of us that are adults right now in these 2024 era probably didn't get that. We probably didn't get that in class around understanding, naming our emotions. Sometimes at school it's called social emotional learning, and it's about helping students understand, express, and regulate their emotions. And, I personally love all these TikTok videos where you see these super young children expressing what they're actually feeling and using these strategies to regulate their emotions, things like, Mommy, I really need to calm down. Like, just them knowing that is a level at a pretty significant level of emotional intelligence. Where a lot of us as adults, a lot of people say we can't name more than three emotions. We're either happy, mad, or sad, right? We don't have the language for it. We don't recognize it when we feel it. So one of the things you can do is to actually recognize and name the emotions that you're feeling. And you can look up these feeling charts. I have one here I'm going to reference, but you can look up these feeling charts, feeling wheels that give you the language for your feelings. So the one I'm looking at here, it has kind of the main emotions at the top. So it has happy, sad, angry, or mad, afraid, and ashamed. And then on the kind of downward axis, it has, like the y axis, it has what's the intensity of that feeling, high, medium, or low. So a very high, intense, happy feeling are words like excited, overjoyed, thrilled, ecstatic, elated, passionate. And if I go down to a low, intensity of happiness are things like glad, contented, pleasant, tender, pleased, mellow. All of those are words that describe our feelings. And it describes a deeper nuance of how we're feeling. Similarly, if I go to angry, at the high intensity of angry, it's words like furious, enraged, outraged, boiling, irate, seething, betrayed, loathsome. Like that's a very intense, angry feeling. If you go to the low intensity of that, it's things like annoyed, uptight, resistant, irritated, touchy, perturbed, So it's like still the same emotion of anger, but it's expressed in a much lower intensity. So part of one strategy is just being able to name your emotion. What is the emotion that I'm feeling right now? Asking yourself in that moment, how am I actually feeling? And one thing you can do when you're trying to explore this with other people as well. So, is to say, sometimes people say, how are you today? Somehow adding today kind of helps people center on how I'm feeling in this moment and makes it a little less likely for them to say, oh, good. Like, we often do when we're responding to questions. I've also had people say, how are you? You respond and they say, how are you really? It's another opportunity to kind of help someone else express their emotions in a deeper way, name their emotions in a deeper way. And I've been trying this myself in that when someone says, how are you? I try to give it a beat, like a thought to say, almost asking myself, like, how am I really? How am I really? And it's funny when I do that, a lot of times people are like, oh, are you okay? Like they're not used to you taking a beat. They're really used to all of us saying, how are you? I'm good. I'm great. Because it's not a real question. It's more of a just a a way of saying hello. But that's one way I've been kind of trying to get more in touch with my emotions is by no, actually answering that question like, oh, I'm kind of stressed out, or I'm a little worried, or I'm like super excited, or I feel so rested, or I feel really content, like using words that are beyond um, happy, sad, mad, basically, to help me understand where I'm feeling, which helps me also better manage that feeling once I can recognize it. So once you recognize your emotions, then there are strategies you can use to either express them or to regulate them. And a lot of these are things you've heard before. Many of them are also linked to resilience, which is our ability to just bounce back after difficulties or challenges. So these are things like optimism, deciding to choose the best in something, to focus on what's good and the best in something. Gratefulness, being grateful for what we have, choosing to think about how far we've come instead of how far we have to go. Journaling, which is a great way of expressing emotions. It can be stretching, working out. I know a lot of people use walking as a way to calm emotions, center emotions, kind of get rid of negative emotions. Deep breathing, meditation, yoga, counting. I've heard a lot of children do that as well, as a calm down strategy. That's a strategy on managing your emotions. Some people play an instrument or engage in something artsy or crafty. Also, a way of regulating emotions, napping, resting, just getting enough sleep. It's amazing how much better I am in managing emotions when I'm just rested and, I'm not sleepy. And this would also be a lot of things that sit in the self-care, category, whether it's maybe taking a bath or reading a book or massage or whatever it might be, can all help you manage, or sometimes even express your emotions. Another thing can also be distraction strategies. So I've gone to the movies a few times recently. I went to our local museum of art. This is one that you don't want to overuse distractions so much that you're not dealing with the reality of what's going on. But sometimes distractions are helpful to get your mind off of what's going on, or even, compartmentalizing. Like I know that's a big thing, but I'm not going to worry about it today. There are things like the worry box where you write it down and put it in that box and pray over it. And, it's like, I use that's like my way of giving it to God. It's like, you know what? It's above my pay grade here, God, So things you can do to compartmentalize as well are other strategies you can use. And one technique I learned and tried for this specifically is called the body scan. And this is an emotional strategy. It's more of a mindfulness strategy. So mindfulness is about stopping worry and anxiety and focusing on what is here and now, what's in the moment in front of you without judgment. So, as I mentioned, a lot of people do walking as a strategy. And while walking, a lot of people try to practice mindfulness. So I'm paying attention to the temperature, the wind on my skin. I'm looking at the birds or the houses or whatever's around me. I'm listening to what I'm hearing, construction or birds or, people talking, children playing. I'm just really tuning into the moment. And there's a lot of research that says that mindfulness strategies, specifically the body scan I'm going to talk about, but mindfulness strategies are a way of decreasing negative emotions and managing stress. They also can decrease blood pressure, right? So it also has some physical impacts as well. But in the body scan, what you do is you lay flat on your back and get in a relaxed position. And you're basically scanning your body. So you start from toe to head. I went toe to head and then also head to toe. But you're just thinking about how does that part of my body feel in this moment? So, and intentionally relaxing it. So, how do my toes feel? How does my foot feel? How does my ankles feel? And, when I did it, I absolutely felt more relaxed after. And I noticed like a little pain that was in my ankle that I don't think I'd paid attention to. And the other thing the research says is that oftentimes we live really, our mind and body are very disconnected, right? So our mind's focused on one thing, our body's feeling something else, but we're not really putting the two together. And so the body scan is also a way of connecting your mind and your body. Let me be clear on what I'm really feeling. So that's one you can try as well. And that's an example of one that, again, after the body scan, nothing has changed in my situation, but you still may feel less stress and feel better able to take on the things you have because you're managing your emotions better. And, these emotional strategies, I did a coping quiz, and the quiz talked about which do you tend to rely on most, these action-oriented strategies, these emotional strategies, or the negative strategies. And I kind of knew before I took it that my action-oriented strategies is where I go to first. And I think it's because with action-oriented strategies, I feel like I'm doing something. It feels like you're quote unquote making progress. You're doing something, you're changing something. Um, but the reality is that that's not useful, when you can't actually change the situation. And I was on a webinar recently, and I thought this is another emotional strategy that I thought was really interesting. So I was on a webinar recently with Marshall Goldsmith, and he may be kind of the best known executive coach in the US, maybe globally as well. But he asked a question that I thought was really interesting. So he asked us to rate ourselves on a scale of 1 to 10 and our response to this question. Have I done my best to make myself happy today? Have I done my best to make myself happy today? And I'm curious what you would say. I think the day I did it, I thought maybe a 6. And I remember thinking surprised by that. Like, why is it only a 6? What am I not thinking about? And he said that the average from his experience is about a 5.5, which tells me that a lot of us are probably kind of living disconnected lives, meaning we're not using emotional management strategies. We're not tuned into how we're feeling. We're not doing things to intentionally manage that. Because I think that's a pretty deep question. If I'm not even doing my best to make myself happy, we have to wonder how much we're really prioritizing our emotional well-being and happiness on a day-to-day basis. And I'm definitely not saying that life is about happiness. Certainly life is about way more than happiness. It's about purpose and meaning and, doing what's right and character development, all those things. Um, but, if we're not also thinking about our happiness, I just think that's a really great question to think about from our emotions. Are we doing the best to make ourselves happy every day? If not, how tuned in are we to what our emotions are and how we can manage them better to reduce the stress we feel? The last category of strategies is support from others. And this is really when you look at the demand choice support model, this is what that model focused on the most, right? So this is about how connected we are with other people, family, friends, colleagues, people in our communities, people who like the same hobbies we do. And I think what's most interesting about this category is the connection between social support and even longevity, right? So it's interesting how researchers think stress is involved in this relationship between how much support we have and how long we live. So in the 1930s, a study, it's often called the Harvard Study of Adult Development. You can look it up, the Harvard Study of Adult Development. It looked at decades. It looked at participants over decades. Most of the participants were men for sure. But the point is to understand what makes us all happier as humans, what helps us have more meaning in our lives, and really what helps us live longer. And one of the most consistent findings over the 80 years, the study, 80 plus years, the study has been going, is that positive relationships keep us happier, they make us healthier, and help us live longer. So it's so interesting. The research showed that at any point in adult development, people with positive relationships, strong positive relationships, were more likely to be alive, more likely to be healthier, and more likely to be happier. And, in some of the research, they talk about how stress can be an important kind of component of this relationship between the support we have and longevity. And what the research says is that the connection is that talking with others, having support from other people, just being in relationship, you could think about as lunch with friends, walking around the block, just spending time with your family is a stress reliever. And when we don't have that stress reliever, we walk around with a level of kind of a consistent level of stress, oftentimes negative distress in our bodies for long periods of time that isn't being dissipated. And that negative stress in our bodies, as we talked about earlier, is having physical impacts on our health. So it's interesting. One of the researchers on this study, Robert Waldinger, you can look him up. Pretty sure he has a TED Talk video, and he just talks about this concept of social fitness, meaning just like we exercise our bodies for physical fitness, there are things we have to do to create a strong social network. One of those is invest in those relationships. I remember our pastor at church one time was talking about having relationships with people in the church. Lots of people say, "Oh, I don't want to go to a church where I'm just in and out. I want to know people." And he was saying, yeah, in order to do that, you have to invest the time. He was like, as soon as the service is over, you can't have roller skates on, rolling out to the car, popping in your car and going home. No, you actually have to stay after, maybe go to an event, join a group, talk to people. Like it takes an investment to build this support. And so I want to read a quote from Waldinger about his research and about this study. I thought it was so interesting. But one thing he said that I think kind of goes to this point of it's also not a one size fits all, right? So it's not like there's one way to have this network of relationships. So what he said, which I thought was interesting, was there's no set number of connections you need to have. If you have everything you need in your family, that's great. But what we find is that the benefits of relationships come from anywhere. They certainly come from family, but they come from friends, work colleagues. We even get small bits of well being from a chat with the person who makes coffee for us in the coffee shop, or the cashier who checks us out in the grocery store, or the mail carrier. If we have pleasant connections with those people, those also contribute to our well being. And, the last part of what he said was that what we see in our research is that everybody needs at least one solid relationship, someone who they feel they can count on in times of need. And just reading some articles about it, one way to think about it is if you wake up scared in the middle of the night or there's some emergency, who can you talk to? Who would you call? Do you have someone you could call? So, one part of this is having the relationship. And then the second part is being willing to rely on that relationship. Sometimes we live such solo lives, we're all trying to be so okay that we don't really share what's going on. Maybe, they call it you're the strong friend. So maybe we're the strong friend, the strong brother, the strong sister, and we're always focused on helping others and really won't admit when we're not okay. So, the guidance for stress management is one, cultivate positive relationships with others, and then rely on those relationships when you need them. I remember one time years ago, and it really stood out to me because I think this is when I really understood the connection of relationships and stress. But I was like so stressed at work. I don't even remember what's going on, which is also interesting that the thing that this memory that is so vivid for me about how so stressed I was, I can't even remember what it was about. That there's a lesson in that around like us worrying about stuff that really doesn't matter because I can't even remember. But I remember being super stressed at work, and my sister at the time lived, like almost around the corner from me. And I remember calling her and I was like, "Hey, you want to do something?" I just felt like I just had to get out. I had to do something different. And she was like, "Yeah, let's go to the mall." I think we went and looked at makeup and other things. And I mean, it was so, when I got home, I just remember feeling so at ease, like physically different. Like I personally can feel the stress in my body. Like I can feel it in my neck. I can feel it in my shoulders. I can feel it in my stomach. Like when I'm stressed, I can physically feel it. And I remember getting home and thinking, wow, I feel amazing. And that was one of those examples of nothing changed with my work situation, but I felt totally different by just connecting with someone else on totally, other things. I don't even know if we talked about what was going on at work, but it just was such a stress reliever. It was a way for that stress to dissipate and kind of leave my body. So, the study says really you only, as long as you have one solid person. But I know for me, it's a blessing to have more than one person as well to rely on to cultivate those relationships because I don't know if one person could handle all my stuff. I don't, maybe they could. I don't know. Maybe they could handle every call I want to make or something. I don't know, to complain about something or to tell someone or when I need to go out or, but I'm also a pretty social person. And that's something else the research showed as well. So if you're, pretty extroverted, I'm kind of in the middle, honestly, but if you're very extroverted, you might need a lot more social connections. If you're very introverted, you may not need as many. But So again, it's not one size fits all, but I'm kind of in the middle. I need a few, I need a few of those. And there's some articles written about just different roles friends might play for us. So, one is the safety and security. So, do you have someone you can call in an emergency or a moment of crisis? Another one is growth or learning. Do you have someone that, encourages you to try new things, to take choices, to pursue your goals? Another one is the fun and relaxation. Who do you have that just you laugh with? Who do you call when you go to a movie? You want to go to a movie, do a road trip, just have fun and relax. And then do you have someone for confiding? Someone that just knows you really well. They're kind of someone you're comfortable telling everything to. And when you're really down, you're really low, you really need to talk someone out, do you have someone to call for that as well? So, having people to fill these roles in our lives and filling it in other people's lives as well is a buffer to stress because it helps us dissipate that stress out of our body. And because of that, it's a real key to longevity as well. So, when you think about your ways of coping with stress and these four categories, which do you think you use most often? And would using one more or less kind of help you better manage the stress in your life? So, the action strategies that are about concrete, doing things to solve the problem, to make changes, the negative strategies, which are things that actually get in our way. It helps us cope in the moment. Short term, we might feel better for, that 30 minutes or whatever it is. But afterwards, the impact of it, the consequences of it may actually make the situation worse and definitely don't make it better. Emotional strategies, which we talked about today, again, don't change the situation, but help us manage the negative emotions. And then support from others. So, getting more support from other people, cultivating those relationships, and also being willing to rely on those relationships. So, which one of these, if you were to invest in, might help you, one, reduce your stress, have a greater well being, reduce your likelihood for burnout, or even help you to recover from burnout more quickly? And, which I think is so interesting from a research standpoint, just help you live a healthier, longer life. So let me know what you're thinking. I have loved this initial three-part series on burnout, and we're not done with the topic in the season because we're going to have other people on to talk about different aspects of it, stress management, well-being in general, sharing their personal experiences, which I think are so helpful to learn from. But this is our kickoff of the topic, and I'm glad you've joined. The first two episodes on this topic are also available now if you haven't listened to those. And, listen, thank you all so, so much for joining. Drop me an email. Let me know what's going on with you in this topic. What strategies are you using? What strategies are you considering using? If you're not in my email group, there's a link to join the crew in the show notes. Or at the end of the YouTube video, if you're watching there, there's a QR code that you can use to join as well. And as always, you can find me on Instagram at Arlene_pace_green. And if no one has told you today, I love you. I am so, so proud of you. You are killing it. And we are going to keep killing it while not killing ourselves in the process. Love you and be well.